Hey guys, thanks for joining me on a new video on Annie Analyzes. Today I'm going to be telling you a mystery. Don't worry, I will make my way back to understanding Ozark, but today I figured I'd break it up and tell you about the Yuba County Five because I'm absolutely fascinated by the mystery surrounding this case and it's incredibly perplexing, and you guys will see why. If you've never heard of the Yuba County Five, I'm excited to be the one to tell you about it, so let's jump in. To prepare myself to tell you this story today, I did rewatch the Files of the Unexplained episode last night because of the family interviews. It's important to know these men's personalities before we talk about the story and talk about what happened to them because it could explain some of the behaviors that took place that night and led to what we know today. And it could answer a lot of the questions that people have surrounding this mystery. They lived in Marysville, California, and they met at something called the Gateway Project, which allowed mentally handicapped individuals to learn how to play sports and mingle, make friends, make connections. So, Jack, who liked to go by Jackie Hewitt, was 24 years old, but he's said to have the mindset of a 16-year-old. And his sister in law from the episode of The Files of the Unexplained said that he never viewed anybody as a bad person. And his best friend was Ted Weir, and they were incredibly close. People describe them as being brothers because they were together so much. Ted Weir was 32 years old, and it was really sweet to see his brothers talk about him in the episode because they talked about how much he loved mac and cheese. They also noted that sometimes his mind just couldn't put everything together, and at the very end of the episode, they talked about if he had still been there, he probably would have been living with the brothers because he couldn't live unassisted. So there's another Jack in the group, but he liked to go by Doc. So Doc Madruga was 30 years old when he went missing, and he was known as not being as outgoing as the other men, so he had a hard time making friends. And that's why he found himself at the Gateway Project in order to be a little bit more outgoing and to play basketball with them. He served in the army and he went to Vietnam, but then he was honorably discharged. And his best friend was Bill Sterling. So Bill Sterling was 29 years old when he went missing, and his friends and family describe him as being very religious and deeply compassionate. He had a very strong sense of morality and kindness, and he would go out of his way for others. He had a mild intellectual disability. He relied on his family mostly for structure, but he was very high functioning in daily life. Gary Mathias was 25 years old when he went missing, and he was a late addition to the group of men, so he wasn't as close to them. But he served in the military, but he was given a medical release because he was believed to be schizophrenic. But he was seeing a psychiatrist and was put on medication, and he seemed to be functioning very well in daily life and socializing very well. So the group of five men used to walk everywhere, but then Jack Madruga got his car, which was a 1969 Mercury Montego. And this car was the pride and joy of Jack Madruga. Our story begins February 24th, 1978, and this is when the five young men decided to pile into Jack Madruga's car and drive to Chico State, which was about an hour from Marysville. And their favorite basketball team was UC Davis, and they were playing Chico State that night. So they were so excited to go see their favorite team, hopefully celebrate a win. But a very big detail in this case is they also had their own basketball team in the Gateway Project. They were called the Gateway Gators. The next day, so it would have been February 25th, they had a very big championship game. So some of the family members were a little hesitant to let some of their boys go because of this game. They had to be ready, they had to be prepared because this was really, really important to all of them. So the morning of February 25th, it was discovered that the men never returned home. So the families were calling around. They were like, hey, have you seen Ted? Have you seen Jack? Have you seen Gary? But none of the other families had heard from their boys. And this was incredibly uncharacteristic for them, not only because they had their championship game, but because they thrived so heavily on structure and routine. And their families were just like, there's no way. There's no way. They would never go out and run away, right? The families tried to file a police report and report them missing, but the investigators said, They're 18, there's nothing we can do. And this was especially upsetting because the families pushed and pushed because they said they have these mental disabilities. There's no way they would just run away. They're a little bit more vulnerable. But the police were like, our hands are tied. You have to wait 24 to 48 hours, which I believe is a BS rule. On February 28th, 1978, the Forest Service had discovered Jack Madruga's car in the Plumas National Forest. And this was incredibly odd because this is 70 miles in the wrong direction of Marysville, California. And they discovered that their car could have easily been pushed out of the snowbank. And there was no significant damage to the undercarriage that would suggest that something bad had happened. But the driver's side window had been rolled down and the keys were nowhere to be found. Investigators had noted that there were also milk cartons and candy wrappers in the back seat, which kind of suggested their excitement, which was like more of a kid's celebration than it was a adult celebration. But investigators had contacted the milk manufacturers to see where the local vendors were. And they found a market in Chico called Bear Market. And a woman who had been working the night of the 24th had said that she had remembered the young men, and it was around closing time, which was like 10 p.m. This is when the search had ensued. And it was really sad to hear Jackie Hewitt's brother talk about this in the episode of the Files of the Unexplained, because he talked about how their father, Jack Hewitt Sr., was there every single day looking for Jackie. And it was really interesting because he also said that their family had hunted that area for years and years and years. So he was very familiar with the terrain in this area. Unfortunately, the weather was bad enough that they had to keep starting and stopping and starting and stopping the search. And by the time that it was about June, they had completely stopped searching. On June 4th, 1978, about 3.5 months after the men had disappeared, motorcyclists were driving past a campground in the Plumas National Forest when they smelled something terrible coming from the Forest Service trailers, and it was also noted that one of the windows had been smashed in. This is when the incredibly emaciated body of Ted Weir was found. His body position was also very odd because he was laying on his back with his hands across his chest, and he was wrapped very tightly in several sets of sheets. So this told investigators that there had to be somebody there when he died. While I was editing this video, I realized that I forgot a really important detail. So, when the investigators went into the trailer where Ted Weir was found, they also found Gary Mathias's shoes. They were a pair of black Converse. So, they knew they were Gary Mathias's shoes, but they also found that Ted Weir did not have his shoes. So, it's theorized that if Gary went to look for help, he took the better pair of shoes, which were Ted Weir's, and left his behind. So I just needed to include that because it's a really important part to see possibly what happened to Gary Mathias. He suffered from terrible frostbite and starvation. When he went missing, he was about 220 pounds, but when they found his body, he was only 120 pounds. He was also reported to be clean shaven when he went missing, but he had a full grown beard when he was discovered. So this suggests he was alive for 8 to 13 weeks. The trailers were about 19 miles from where Jack Madruga's car had been abandoned. It's important to note that the road where they had abandoned the car was a logging road. So there was no reason for them to be up there. So the huge question is, why did they stop there? Unfortunately, on June 6, 1978, the badly decomposed remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found. They were about 7 miles south of the trailers, and Jack Madruga still had the keys to his Montego in his pocket. And Bill Sterling's body was across the road from Jack. And it was said that they were such close friends that it's most likely that if one of them was succumbing to the elements, then the other probably stayed around to keep them company. On June 7th, 1978, Jackie Hewitt's remains were finally discovered. And unfortunately, they were found by his father, but Jack Hewitt Sr. had promised his son that he would find him and bring him home. So his body was identified by his clothing and his shoes that were found nearby, but it was confirmed through dental records. I bet you're also wondering, where are Gary Mathias's remains? They were never discovered. He just kind of vanished. But there were alleged witness sightings, like Jack Madruga's niece said in the episode that she was working at her mother's bar and swore that she saw Gary Mathias drinking at the bar, and like a third Barstool. She swore on her life that it was Gary Mathias. There was also a man driving up the road where Madruga's car was found that said he alleged that Gary Mathias was hitchhiking. It's really sad to hear Gary Mathias' siblings talk about him in the documentary because so many people are still pointing fingers at him when nobody really knows the truth. And we'll talk about the theories in a minute, but his brother had said nobody in this 40 odd years had ever asked him any questions until this 2024 interview with Netflix. No cops had spoken to him, no media, and it's hard to say definitively what had happened. And there's been no remains found, no confirmed sightings of him in society. So we really have no idea what happened to Gary Mathias. It's finally time for me to reveal the most perplexing detail in the entire case. The trailer that Ted Weir was found in had ample survival supplies. There was a food locker outside of the trailer that had lots of canned food in it. Some of it was taken and consumed, but there was a second food locker inside the trailer that was never touched. There was also a propane heater outside that was also never touched or turned on. And a lot of people question why didn't they take advantage of these supplies? And we kind of catch a glimpse of an explanation from Ted's brothers. They say if he perceived anything as illegal, he wouldn't have done it. So if he thought taking the food from those food lockers was stealing, he would have never touched it. Even if this is the explanation, if we believe that somebody was there with Ted while he passed away, why didn't they take advantage of the supplies? But this is that situation where you answer one question and 20 more can pop up. The way media had portrayed them was so disheartening. Even Jackie Hewitt's brother in the documentary said, oh, why did they have to use the R word to describe them? If they had said 5 young basketball championship winners went missing, maybe they would have gotten more positive attention. And this is where people believe that the investigation was botched because these young men were considered slow because of their mental disabilities. People believe they weren't as capable as much as somebody who didn't struggle with these intellectual disabilities. This can be seen because the investigators were told several times that the trailers were there by Jack Hewitt Sr. and the Forest Service. They were asked several times to please just check the trailers, but since the investigators believed that they weren't capable of hiking 20 miles, they probably didn't make it there, which, if they had checked, they probably may have found them. Okay, now I'm going to discuss some of the possible theories. One is that they got lost and panicked. So maybe they accidentally drove into the Plumas National Forest after the game, got stuck, and then panicked. So they wandered deeper into the wilderness and then exposure had killed them. The evidence for this is the car was found to be stuck, but not badly damaged. They were on unfamiliar roads and they were ill prepared to be in this kind of environment. The problems with this is their car wasn't truly stuck. Investigators had found that the car could easily be pushed out. They were considered responsible and were unlikely to respond in this way. Another theory is they were lured or forced up the mountain. Some of the supporting evidence is none of the men had any reason to go up to the mountains at night. The placement of their bodies suggests they split up under stress or confusion. This could fit into some kind of coercion. The problems with this is there's no direct evidence of foul play, so their car didn't show any signs of forced entry or being tampered with, and there's just no credible suspect. The next theory kind of centers around Gary Mathias' schizophrenia. So the evidence for this is he obviously had the known psychiatric history and could be disoriented during stress. He also had the military survival training, which might explain why his body was never found if you believe he had escaped. So the problems with this, like I mentioned earlier, if he had survived, there have been no confirmed sightings of him and there's been no trace of him in nearly 50 years. The next theory that I believe is the most plausible is they just had a simple misadventure and then a chain of bad decisions had followed. Some of the evidence for this is they may have genuinely thought that there was help nearby, so that's why they kept going. But the problem with this is it doesn't explain why they actually went up the mountain. I saw in the documentary that someone theorized they were so hyped up on sugar and got excited. They went on an adventure up the mountain, thought that they could do this, panicked, and that's how they disappeared. So there's a story that I have a hard time believing. Even the person who's involved in the story believes he could be hallucinating, but it's called the heart attack story. So there's a witness. His name is Joseph Shones. He was a 55-year-old man and he was living near where the men's car was later found. He tells a story of leaving his house February 24th, which was the night of the disappearance, and he says he was driving his Volkswagen Bug up the mountain to check the conditions for a family trip for the weekend. So, what had happened was while he was driving, his car got stuck. When he was attempting to push it out, he was experiencing chest pains, later described as a possible mild heart attack. Since he was unable to get his car out, he stayed in his car for several hours through the night. So, what he later reported seeing was he thought he saw a group of men, a woman, and a baby walking in the snowy roads at night with a flashlight. He called out to them for help, but they ignored him and kept walking. And hours later, he saw the flashlight again and heard whistling noises and saw figures moving outside his car with the flashlight. He obviously didn't investigate because he was too weak. And by the next morning, he got better and he walked down the mountain and he saw Jack Madruga's car. He believed that the figures were the Yuba County Five, but he also believes he may have been hallucinating. So the thing that gets me about that is these men were all described as being very helpful, caring people. So if they had known somebody needed help, they most likely would have stopped and helped. And I don't know. I think that's an out there theory, but there's nothing confirmed about that either. Could be true. I have no idea. It's just a story. So watching the documentary, my heart was so heavy for the families because I can't imagine losing a loved one in this way with no answers. But I hope you guys enjoyed. I loved telling you this story. I loved doing some extra research and looking into this again. If I had one wish, I would solve the Yuba County 5 mystery. Bye, guys.